Right, hit the blue button that says that you know that we're recording. I'm going to hide my meeting controls here. Okay, so today we're going to talk about punishment as defined and as related to applied behavior analysis, since this is an ABA training and we are an ABA program. That's really what we want to focus on. We're going to talk kind of about, the general view of punishment versus ours, etc. throughout. Um, all right, so start off with some housekeeping and reminders. So remember, if you do unmute at any point, not to use any client information whatsoever. That includes names, initials, descriptions, addresses. I don't know why you would name their address, but no client information used during the training. We are recording, so please mute when you are not talking, as part of the training. I want you to consider throughout the training, how are you going to apply this information? A training is only as good as how far it is used. So think about, how does it apply to your cases? How might it apply to your cases? Where have you seen it? How can you use it? So that's my end, is to present the information in an engaging manner. Your end is to absorb the information and to think about how it could be useful. And then just a reminder that in order to get credit for this does count for, CEs and for ongoing training credit, but you do need to complete the post test in order to do so. If you're attending live today, you will get an email. If you're watching it later, the instructions are included in the video information. So let's talk about punishment. So I want to start with a caution. And I think that this is a very important part of all of this. And we're going to talk about a bunch of cautions. There's a lot of caution involved in the use of punishment. But I want to start with an establishment of this kind of, basic fact that punishment does feel good or right or just or, deserved. So punishment is really baked into our society, into our family approaches, all of those things. And it feels good. It feels, maybe not permanently, but in the moment, it feels good to, say that thing that really shuts someone down, to really, stick it to somebody who said something to you, to slug somebody who harmed you or somebody that you care about. So I want us to recognize and accept that punishment does feel good. And why is that important to put out there? Well, because we have to be aware that other people are going to be motivated for us to use punishment. We're going to at times feel motivated to punish. And, kids are going to want to punish each other and sometimes even themselves, and we punish ourselves. So it's very important that we're aware of this. Just like in the de-escalation training, we talked about how natural it is to, to strike back. This is that same kind of emotional response or ingrained response. And studies, the links or the references are at the end. Several studies show that children as young as 6 and even earlier begin to prefer punishment over reward, even at the cost of having to give up something. They will pay to see someone else punished when they feel that that person deserves punishment. So that tells me, that if they start around that age, they're seeing it, from their parents, from their friends, from TV, and they are kind of building that concept of deservedness of punishment. But for whatever reason, it's very important that we recognize that at some point very early in our lives, we start to really enjoy seeing other people punished when we feel like they deserve it. So we must be really cognizant of these leanings. And it's really interesting because I think as we go through this training, we're going to talk a lot about how people say, well, I never use punishment. We don't use punishment here in this center, in this school, in this house. So that seems like those two things seem like they can't exist. And we're going to kind of clear that up as we go through, because their definition of punishment is a little bit shaky compared to how we look at it. But there is that reality that when someone hurts or wrongs us, we are going to lean towards punishment. I've seen it with staff, I've seen it with parents, I've seen it in myself, this kind of insistence of like, no, no, we don't punish. But in the moment, we want that to happen. Uh, and the reward poster made me giggle. I think it's the perfect example of this is that we're paying money to hunt down people dead or alive. This is, we don't really do that anymore, right? There's still bounty hunters, apparently. But I think they're supposed to bring them back alive. But I don't know. I don't know. That's a whole part of society that I'm not completely aware of. So let's back up a little bit and let's just do a quick reminder about our three-term contingency, which are the building blocks of the applied behavior analysis science. Okay, so we're looking at three pieces of a chain. So I like to start in the middle, which doesn't make a huge amount of sense, but I like to always think, okay, what's the target behavior? What's the behavior in question? What behavior are we thinking about? Okay, because it could be anything. It could be hitting, it could be breathing, it could be, singing a song, it could be saying thank you. Behavior is really just runs a huge gamut. Um, but we start there, okay? Because then we can dial back and say, okay, what happened right before that behavior? It's hard to pin down an antecedent if you don't know what behavior you're looking at. So what happened right before? Okay, so that's the antecedent. What preceded it directly? Okay, so it could include all the factors. Remember, like, oh, I didn't get a good night's sleep last night. That certainly is impactful, but the antecedent to the behavior is always, sometimes we refer to it as the trigger. Okay, but what happened like right before? Okay, that happened, boom, now the behavior. And then the consequence. Okay, so what happens as a result directly after the behavior? Okay, not a long-term consequence, right? So like me drinking soda may someday give me diabetes. Okay. But it's not going to do that today, right? When I drink it, it's going to taste good. So that's the immediate consequence. That's the one I'm really most concerned about because that's the one that really impacts our behavior most steadily and readily. So just a reminder, ABC, we want to kind of be there. So let's focus now. Let's talk about the consequence part of that. Okay. So the behavior happens and then there's a consequence. Okay. So when the consequence occurs, okay, so you took a bite of a sandwich, okay, it tasted delicious, okay. So in the future, okay, is you taking a bite of that kind of sandwich going to happen more, happen the same amount, or happen less? These are the options. There's really not, it could be uncertain. We might not know, okay, but one of these things is kind of in play after that consequence happens. So if the sandwich tasted delicious, one might think that, well, I'm going to order and eat this sandwich more often, so that would happen more, in which case we're talking about reinforcement. Okay. But today we want to talk about punishment. So we're going to talk about when the consequence follows the behavior, and then in the future, okay, that behavior happens less. It's less likely to occur in the future. It can't change the behavior that already happened, right? Sandwich is already bitten, face is already struck, spit is already, flying across the room. But what's going to happen in the future, the next time that this chain kind of occurs? Is it going to happen more, less, or about the same? So less is punishment. That's what we're talking about today. So I went to the white book, okay, which is apparently no longer white, which is somewhat upsetting. But so like the ABA book, and the Cooper book. So they define it as a stimulus change immediately following a response that decreases the future frequency of that type of behavior in similar conditions. Okay, it's wordy, right? So let's break it down. Okay, first let's start with the simplest explanation that we already kind of talked about, right? The behavior after the behavior happens. Okay, a stimulus response, a change occurs. Okay, so usually this happened. Now we're going to do this. Okay. And in the future, the behavior happens less. Okay. So let's break that down a little bit. Okay. So here we've got a little chain here. So let's talk about hitting. Okay. So hitting is a hot topic. Okay. So our behavior is hitting. Okay. And as a result of the hitting, okay, the consequence is lots of high quality attention. Okay. And when I say high quality, I don't necessarily mean like what we would think of as positive. It's just like it's big, right? It's loud attention, right? Everybody's running over. How could you? You hit. This is unacceptable. We cannot do this. This is not okay in our classroom. You need to keep your hands to yourself. That's not okay, right? This whole lots of high quality attention, right? And we see that because of that, the behavior occurs frequently, even more frequently than it did before. Okay. So that is not a punishment chain. Okay. So this would be because the behavior is occurring more frequently, that's a reinforcement chain. Okay. So let's redo this. Let's try one that that is punishment. Okay. So the behavior is hitting still. Okay. As a result of the hitting, mom says, oh, Wi-Fi's done. She flips the switch. Okay. She pulls the plug, whatever it is, the Wi-Fi goes off. Okay. And she does this reliably when the hitting occurs. And because of that, in the future, the hitting and pinching occurs less. Okay. So why did I include pinching? Just to kind of draw attention to the fact that in this definition, it says that type of behavior decreases in the future. So you sometimes get some freebies. Okay. Hitting and pinching are not exactly the same. Okay. But they might in the child's head kind of put those things together. So even though you don't turn off the Wi-Fi after they pinch, they're still pinching less. Okay. Now, those of you out there who have taken a lot of these trainings or a lot of ABA courses are thinking, well, Rob, you're probably also doing some reinforcement stuff to build up the things you want them to do instead. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. And that might be why they're hitting and pinching less. Okay. But all that aside, okay, this is a punishment chain. Okay. So they've been hitting. Okay. Now we start turning the Wi-Fi off as an immediate consequence to the hitting, and the hitting starts occurring less. And in this case, we even get a freebie of the pinching is also occurring less. Okay. Gina, we feel pretty clear on that. That feel solid so far?
Yes.
Awesome.
Can you see me?
No.
Okay, gotcha. You're good.
Okay. All right. So now, you guys have seen the four framed kind of chart with positive and negative of punishment and reinforcement. So we just need to make sure that we're clarifying the difference between positive punishment and negative punishment. Okay. So positive punishment. Okay. Remember, the important thing about punishment is that the future likelihood of the behavior goes down. Okay. Goes down. That's the important thing. That's what makes it punishment. Okay. It's not the way that you did it or whether it was nice or whether it was, a good intervention. That really doesn't matter. That does matter in the grand scheme of things, right? We want to be doing good interventions, in a respectful and ethical way. But the real, secret ingredient is that the behavior in the future goes down, or else it's not punishment. So positive punishment adds something to the environment. Okay. Something that wasn't there before is now added. Okay. So, and we'll talk about, kind of examples of that, but it could be yelling, right? There was no yelling before. Now there's yelling. Okay. Uh, putting an X on the board. There was no X before. Now there's an X. Now you might be thinking, well, but what if that X means that they lose recess? Well, okay, then that's a little bit trickier. But then ultimately, I would say that that's negative punishment, okay, which is removing something that decreases the future likelihood of the behavior. Okay, so losing time, losing privileges. Okay, so something goes away, leaving the room. The preferred staff member leaves the room. And in order to remember this, okay, think of plus and minus. Because when we think positive, we think good. When we think negative, we think bad. Okay. And that's not the case. ABA wants that judgment gone. Okay. Good and bad is not really, ethical and unethical. Good, right? We want to consider that, right? Effective, ineffective. Yes. Right. But good and bad is not as helpful. But definitely when you're thinking about positive and negative in terms of punishment and reinforcement, I think of them as pluses and minuses. Okay. Plus, add, minus, because negative, right? So not good. And Michael Jackson's arguably greatest album, bad. There's a lot of throwbacks in this one, so buckle up. I don't know what was going on in my brain while I was picking graphics, but there's a lot of things that you should all know Michael Jackson. If you don't, go out and listen to the album. But there's going to be some in here that are not for everybody. So positive punishment, negative punishment. Um, pretty easy to understand, but we'll come back to that as we talk about, different variations. All right, so true or false? Okay, this is a rhetorical question. I'm going to answer it. In ABA, we don't use punishment. I've heard this said before. Okay, and it is absolutely false. Okay. So firstly, ABA is a science that explains human behavior. It's not a list of interventions that are okay and not okay, right? At its core, applied behavior analysis is a science that says this is why people do things, this is why people don't do things, this is how you can get people to do things, teach them, right? This is how you get people to stop doing things. This is how it works, right? Um, so it doesn't dictate, like, oh, we do this and we don't do this. It might say this is ethical and this is unethical as far as like our ethical code goes. Okay, but the heart of ABA is just that science of human behavior of why it happens. But secondly, it's not ABA that decides what we can or can't do. It's our own ethical kind of moral compass, right? It is the insurance companies who say you can't do that. That's not acceptable. Okay. It's the state, who puts out like legislation and regulations that say this is acceptable, this is not. Okay. It's the BACB, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, who holds our certificates as both BCBAs and RBTs. So it's KidsPeace or whatever agency you're involved in. Those are really the determinants of that, as well as society as a whole, right? Kind of ultimately decides what's okay and what's not okay. But there's no rule in ABA that says we don't use punishment. In fact, there's a lot of rules that say in this situation you should use punishment. In this situation, you should consider using punishment. In this situation, if these things fail, you should move to punishment. Okay. And there's a lot of research saying that using punishment is the most effective and quickest way to behavior change that will make the child's life better. Right. So that's stuff we all need to be cognizant of, because if we're just saying, oh, we don't use ABA, then we're throwing out, the baby with the bathwater. False. There we go, Dwight. Well done, buddy. There's a lot of office in this one as well. Oh, time for your first code word already. So the code words, there's four of them today because it is a longer training. And these four code words, I was out in the kayak on Tuesday, paddling around the lake near my home. And there are four things that I saw that were interesting that I will tell you about today. And those will be the four code words. The first one is lily pad flowers. They might have like some sort of fancier name than lily pad flowers, but that's what they look. There's just thousands of them. It was like I was there on the right day. I don't know how long they last, but I assume it's not a long, long time. So the whole lake was just covered in lily pad flowers, which is troublesome when you're kayaking around because that meant the whole pond is covered in lily pads. I call it a pond and a lake. It's a long story, but it is actually a lake, although we call it mud pond. So the first code word, move on, Rob, is lily pad flowers. Okay, and remember, these are multiple choice. So if you spell it differently than I do, that's okay. That's not the heart of it. Lily pad flowers, number one. Okay. All right. Okay, so we did not invent punishment. Okay, ABA, a lot of times, if you've been on TikTok, okay, or any other kind of social media platform where they're talking about applied behavior analysis, they kind of put a lot of blame on ABA for being like the root of all punishment. And that's just absolutely absurd. Um, in fact, like punishment is just baked into our culture, our society, globally, locally. It is just the way that we handle most things. Okay. So, it's not an ABA thing. It's a people thing. It's a world thing. An organism thing. It's happening all the time. So, some examples of things that happen in our society. What happens when you perform poorly at work? You get written up, you get fired, you get laid off, okay? You get a demotion, right? as much as we would love to say like, oh, we don't really have to do that because we provide so many incentives for good employees. And this isn't like a KidsPeace story. This is like everybody's story, right? Like there might be some people who have figured it out, but for the most part, we really rely on punishment in order to shape employees. That's not an ABA thing, that's a world thing. Being good schools, detention, suspension, expulsion. Okay. So that's how we deal with problem behavior at school. We remove it, we punish that behavior. Hey, timeout, social shunning, banning, canceling, right? So my kid's always talking about how he got banned from Fortnite or whatever for no reason at all. That's not true. But that's kind of the go-to. Again, not praising them or rewarding them for positive behavior. There's a little bit of that, but largely we rely on those punishment things. Um, and a lot of people are using timeouts, right? Whether it's right or wrong, it's used a lot, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along. Parking tickets, speeding tickets, fines, community service. Okay, you did something bad, you have to engage in this behavior so you do it less in the future. Lots of punishment there. Giving someone a talking to, yelling at them, telling them how they disappointed you, telling them how, their words or actions hurt you. Okay. All of those things are done with the intention to decrease the behavior. And hopefully like it's starting to ring some bells in your head at this point of like, oh, well, I tell someone that they hurt my feelings all the time. That's not punishment. Okay, well, if the intention is that they do it less in the future, okay, and it works, so they do that thing less in the future, you've punished their behavior, even though you did it really nicely and, in like a, socially positive manner or whatever, however you frame it, you still, in ABA terminology, punish their behavior, okay, or at least intended to. Loss of privileges, restricted access, revocation of licenses or certificates, right? So like if I screw up as a BCBA, the go-to is going to be take his license, right? If I really screw up. It's not quite that easy, but not license, certification. So that's a very common thing. Penance, confession. So in the church, right? Up to damnation, right? Okay, but excommunication, being kicked out, right? Losing privileges. So that's a big thing, even in the religious community. Public humiliation or shaming, right? So that's why Michael's thief picture is here. That's also so that the employees at the restaurant know, like, oh, don't let that person in. But there's like I've driven by like restaurants and like on their billboard they have "Don't serve Rob Harvey. He's a crook," right? Ooh, right? Huge public humiliation and shaming, right? And people love to do this on social media, right? That's a big thing. So we put it out there, right? With the intention to decrease the behavior. And then jail up to execution, right? So like we are really firm with the use of punishment. We do it all the time, right? So again, like it's not an ABA thing, right? ABA explains how it can be useful or how it can be dangerous or whatever, but it's not something that certainly not something that we made up. Okay. Because the problem is with the name. Okay, so in the grand scheme of things, when people think of punishment, they think of like, forceful, aggressive, wrongful punishment. Okay, so we see this situation a lot. We have the same teacher, okay, really frustrating, saying, absolutely not. We're not going to do that. We do not use punishment in my classroom because we come to them when we say, like, hey, we'd like to use this punishment procedure because they're hitting a lot or they're biting or they're running out or whatever it might be. Absolutely not. We do not use punishment in this classroom. And then you get the same teacher, maybe that same day, maybe 5 minutes later, okay, talking about the same behavior. And you're like, okay, well, we'd like to introduce some reinforcement systems. And they say, absolutely not. This child needs consequences. Okay. They must know that there are consequences to their behavior. I just heard this 30 minutes ago in an onsite that I was doing. Okay. So here's another office reference. They're the same picture, right? They're talking about the same thing. They're just talking about it in a different way than we do. And whose fault is that? Is that our fault for like redefining what like our like like ABA's fault for like redefining exactly what punishment means, or is that the world's fault or the teacher's fault or whatever? It doesn't really matter whose fault it is, okay? But there is like a failure to communicate, and there's also another big problem here of this insistence on consequences. I'm pointing to the wrong one. There. Okay. This insistence on consequences that they can't kind of get over. People are really stuck on like they can't learn that they can get away with something. Okay. Justice must be served. Okay. We feel really good when a person is punished when we feel like they deserve it. And that's a dangerous feeling. Okay. So we run into this a lot. This like they don't want to provide reinforcement. Okay, but they don't want to use a planned punishment strategy because they can't say the word punishment. So we have to really do this, we have to do, the dance, we got to really make sure that we're doing it carefully and with, with an ethical procedure. Okay. So, what do people think punishment looks like to kind of go through? So this is what people think. If I say like, think of punishment. Okay. Maybe I should have done that first before I change the slide. Close your eyes and think of punishment, right? These are the kind of things that people drum up into their brain. And these could be examples of punishment, right? I'm not saying this isn't punishment. These could be punishment if they decrease the likelihood of the future behavior. Okay. Um, but these are all questionable, right? I would not, most of these are absolutely unacceptable. Okay. Some of them, are definitely questionable. Okay. So this is what people's brains think of when you say we're going to use a punishment procedure. They're thinking of these pictures. Okay. But they're not thinking about the fact that these things are also punishment. Okay. Or potentially could be punishment. Give up the keys, right? Oh, nope, you're losing privileges. A talking to where the kid feels, he looks maybe like he feels bad. Okay, he might just be annoyed. Who knows? Okay, a parking ticket, right? A ticket of any kind, a fine, right? A disgusted glance. Okay, Riri's down there. Drop boy. I'm not gonna. Whatever I did to elicit that look, I'm never going to do that again in the presence probably of any nice looking woman, let alone Rihanna there, who's terribly displeased, right? That's punishment, okay, or could be. Public shame, we got the surrounding, like, oh, everybody's looking at me, boy, I'm not going to do that again, okay? Ignoring guy on his phones, not paying attention, he's going to get punished for that behavior, but in the meantime, he's diverting his attention away. And then just like the natural kind of things that happen in the world. You burn your finger, whoop, I'm not going to touch that again, right? That first time that you figure out that steam burns not only once but twice, like the vapor and the heat. So these are all things that could punish future behavior, but we don't usually think of these as things that are unacceptable, right? So like yeah, like this creepy guy approached me. Okay, so I gave him a look like back off, right? Like that's not punishment. Well, if it decreased the behavior, they stop doing it. Guess what? Punishment. Okay. All right, so we've got a bunch of examples like this just to kind of make sure that our brains are turned in the right direction. So I'm going to give you a little bit to look over these examples, and I want you to determine which one of these examples is punishment. Gina, did anybody else join us?
Barb is here, but I'm not sure if she's able to unmute or not.
Okay. So if you come up with an answer, you can throw it in the chat, and Gina will read it. Or Gina can answer. Give it a couple more seconds. All right, what do we think? Which one is punishment?
Um, I don't see one. Sorry, I was looking at the thing.
That's okay.
I don't see anything that is punishment here.
Yes, it's a trick question. All right, so for all of you who are looking at this one, that's wrong of me to do. To to start, that probably punishes your behavior of answering questions because I started off with a trick. None of these are punishment. Okay, so Robbie continues to steal. Behavior stays the same. Robbie's rate of screaming did not go down. Not punishment. Now he's hitting about 6 times a day. He was hitting five before. Uh-oh. It looked like punishment, right? So like they're putting X's on the board to lose recess, but I'm losing more recess. So somehow that behavior has been reinforced. Okay. And then the last one, Robbie repeats the question even more when this happens, right? So, that's really, even though I didn't bold it, that was tricky. Okay. We want to know that none of these are examples of punishment because the future likelihood of the behavior is not going down. Okay. But the other thing I want to point out here is we're smacking a kid on the hand, right? Poor little Robbie. We're taking his popcorn for 5 minutes during the movie. We're ignoring the question. We're putting an X on the board, and the board that means losing recess. So all these things in your brain are going to think like, well, those are all punishments, right? Those are all not nice things. But it's not, punishment is not about doing something nice, or it's about affecting behavior. Okay. So when we're talking ABA, none of these are punishment because the behavior is either staying the same or it's going up. Okay. We got to see it go down. All right. I promise the others are not tricks. Okay. So let's look at these four. And Gina, I apologize, but Ashley's in here too, and Julie. So I just use all of our names. So which one of these is punishment? Hey, we got any guesses?
Sorry, I'm still reading.
That's okay. I know it's a lot to read. It's good. You're giving.
I still don't see any punishment here.
Hmm. There should be one. What do you think about this one?
It seems like the behavior hasn't changed.
So if she has to put a dollar in, let me explain why I think that this is punishment. Okay. If she has to put a dollar in the jar every time she ends a day doing less push-ups than she had previously, okay, she's putting a dollar in the jar every single day, which to me tells me that she's doing less push-ups than she was before. So somehow, even though she was trying to reinforce the
Oh, okay. I read it wrong. I see what you're saying
it's
here.
tricky. I should have started with an easier one. Rob, shame on you. Again, I'm punishing you guys. But because she's putting a dollar in the jar when she does less push-ups, that tells us that her baseline of push-ups, she's below her baseline. She was doing I don't know how many before, but she's doing less now. Okay, so somehow, and I have a headcanon as to why I made this up. It's not real, but I have a headcanon as to why this is the case, right? So at the end of the day, I think that Gina thinks like, oh, I'm just going to put a dollar in this jar. I don't have to do the push-ups, right? So we do that sometimes. It's like it almost becomes like an out, right? But it punished the behavior. It was meant to be a reinforcer. It was meant to increase the push-ups. So it doesn't matter what it meant to do. It only matters how it looked or how it affects the future behavior. Um, the other ones all, seemed like they were, or at least the top two, I think, were meant to be punishment procedures, but the nose picking stays at five. Okay. It's still too valuable to pick that nose. Okay. And this one where we're calling her a bully, she seems to like that. That was supposed to be punishment, but didn't work. And then the kale one down at the bottom, right? That's just reinforcement. Okay, and that's just a pretty clear example of reinforcement, and she's eating more kale from the neighbor. Um, all right, which one is not punishment?
D.
D. D is correct. Nice. Okay, so this one's a little bit clearer. Should have started with this one. Okay, so if you only look at the future likelihood of the behavior, this one pretty clearly, the next few days, Ashley throws sticks more often than she had been. Okay, so what does that tell us? That one's reinforcement, not punishment. Okay, the others. Okay, so even though, and these are all like things that look like they should be reinforcement, but so Ashley's putting her chewed up food on her classmates' desks. The teacher starts saying, "Thank you." Why is she doing that? I don't know. But it seemed to work, right? Sometimes we do something we shouldn't do. You should not say thank you when a kid does something like that. But I think sometimes people are like, oh, I'll use reverse psychology. And sometimes, reverse psychology, I guess, works. What's the ABA terminology for that? Gina knows, but I don't want her to tell me right now. Ashley bites her own hand. Okay. One time, Ashley, like, just accidentally, like, she's going to hand her the Swedish fish because she did something she was supposed to do. She doesn't catch that she's biting her hand. But somehow, after that, the hand biting goes down. We don't know why. We don't always know why. Okay. Um, and then this one, like, we think we're reinforcing. We're having the whole class clap. We're saying, all right, Ashley earned us a pizza party. But Ashley's like, "No, I'm never raising my hand ever again." Okay. So inadvertently punishing. Right. So D. D is the answer. Okay. This one's super easy. Which one is punishment?
B.
B. Yep. Right. So we got a solid decline there, even though those scatter points are kind of all over the place. They are trending down, and the trend line is there to kind of show you. A is kind of messy, but it's pretty clearly an upwards trending. C is a clear upwards trend. And D is kind of, who's to say, right? I can't really tell with that one. And you don't even have to, you might be like, oh, look at all those grants awarded. That doesn't seem like punishment, but I just wanted you to look at the line. That was all we were looking at. Okay. Oh, second code word already. All right. So the second thing I saw on my kayak trip on the lake was a green heron, which are very small. Not very small, but smaller than other heron-like birds. Pretty big wings, but they're pretty cool. So I saw a green heron on the lake the other day. So the second code word is green heron. All right, so this one's pretty easy too, okay? And this is really to teach your brain of all really that you're primarily looking at to determine if it's punishment. Which one's punishment?
A.
A, yep, the behavior happens less going forward. Okay. B, it happens more. So we're talking about reinforcement. C, happens the same. So it's, neither. And D, no effect, neither. Okay. Nice job. All right. We're all learning together. All right. So moving on from those examples, we have a couple more questions, coming up in the future in the training, but we're going to set those aside for now. So thank you for playing along. Hopefully you got them right. And if you didn't, you're starting to understand what we're looking for. All right. So we want to have, before we talk about punishment strategies, we're kind of all throughout this, we're kind of mentioning the hazards of punishment. Okay. So when we talk about types of punishment, we have to remember that punishment by nature is somewhat aversive. Okay. If it's not something they're not really enjoying or wanting, okay, uh, then then if it's something that they don't stop. If it's not aversive, that's what we want to say. If it weren't aversive in some way, then it wouldn't be effective as a punishment, right? Uh, so, but we want to remember that punishment involves pain or discomfort, okay, such as things like contingent electronic stimulation, okay, are unacceptable for us to use, right? Probably anybody at all, right? So these are big, like, volatile kind of discussions in the ABA world that we should probably have an opinion on it. Everybody should have an opinion on all things, apparently, is what we're told, but we're not going to do it. It's not acceptable for us. So you don't even have to, decide like, am I okay with this? Am I not okay with this? You don't have to be either because you can't do it. Clearly, like pinching them when they're, doing something they shouldn't, or smacking them, my goodness, like we can't do anything that involves pain. Okay. But most things aren't this obvious. So this is why I put this like gradient at the bottom. Okay. So you've got things on the left that are clearly okay, right? Like, oh, that nobody would have a problem with that, right? Like they're hitting you with a toy, you took the toy, that seems fine, right? Then there's a bunch of stuff that's clearly unacceptable. Smacking the kid, telling them they're worthless, right? Screaming in their face, right? Those things are clearly unacceptable. But most stuff rattles around in this middle, grayish area, okay? Which is really hard. And also because that distinction is so serious and so high stakes, right? You could be reported, you could lose your license, you could use your accreditation, you could lose your job, you could go to jail, you could be fined. You could have all these repercussions for making the wrong, choosing incorrectly, right? So what does that tell us? It tells us to err on the side of caution. If you're not sure, then don't do it, right? Um, but it also tells us that a lot goes into these decisions as to whether or not to use certain procedures. Okay, and we'll talk about kind of the contingencies of that or the considerations of that kind of as we go on. But we have to remember that punishment by nature is aversive. So, we can't say like, oh, we're just not going to use anything aversive because we're going to be uncomfortable. Like the kid's going to have to do some stuff they don't really want to do. Okay, we're going to have to do some stuff that we don't want to do. We talk about that all the time is like growth can be painful, right? But so again, there's stuff that's really clearly like, no, that hurts them. Okay. Whereas like, they don't really like this, but it is something that they need to do. So it's a difficult decision that we need to make together and in an informed manner. But we got to remember punishment by nature has an aversive component. All right, so let's talk about the types of punishment as kind of defined in applied behavior analysis. So we're going to talk first about positive punishment. So we're adding something to the environment that wasn't there previously. So that's a little plus. So the first one we're going to talk about is reprimands, right? Reprimands are the most commonly used attempted punishment, right? So our intention is to punish the learner, okay? Um, Remember, it's not punishment if it doesn't actually decrease the future likelihood of the behavior. So, we're trying to punish them. In our head, we're thinking, okay, I'm punishing them by talking to them. But it just might not pan out because it's the most commonly used, the least commonly effective. Like I say, it's not ever effective. It certainly is effective sometimes, but it has, it's overused in a lot of ways. So it's a verbal statement, okay, that follows the behavior. Okay. Um, so there's missing words there, Rob, with the attempt to decrease the behavior. Okay, that's what that's supposed to say. I'm very tempted to write that in, but I'm not going to. So verbal statement or series of statements that follow behavior with the attempt to decrease the future likelihood of the behavior. So you're saying something, you're telling them something, you're saying something to them. Okay. And this includes all the variations of that: yelling, scolding, explaining, berating, okay, telling them you're disappointed, being sarcastic, right? Like, oh, that was really great. Threatening them with loss of privileges. Now, if you do that again, right? Mocking them, all these things, right? Um, so all that stuff falls under reprimands. Okay, so the behavior happens, you're saying something that's supposed to change that behavior. Okay, and while I don't want to I don't want to poo all over this intervention because it is sometimes effective, right? And there's a couple reasons. So one example is a firm like stop reprimand, right? So they're running towards the street, they're about to hit, okay? They're about to throw something. So a firm stop, no, don't do that, no, right? Those things might stop that behavior in the moment and give you time to intervene. It might also reduce the future likelihood of the behavior depending on your relationship with the person that is in question. Okay, so it really does depend. Okay, so sometimes, like, if we're talking about two adults, two spouses, right? Saying like, hey, like it really upsets me when you do this. Could you try not to do that? You can imagine there are cases where that is effective, and then there's a lot of cases where it's not, right? Um, so it's just important to know that this is the one we kind of lean into the most. Okay, but that is often not valuable. And some other things we do wrong with this is, as we talked about like on previous slides, like sometimes we, instead of just doing a reprimand of like, no, okay, stop, don't do that. We're doing like, oh my God, like, are you serious? You did this again. You know this isn't okay. We've gone over this and over this and over this. Like, this is ridiculous that you keep doing this. You know better. You're too big to do this. You're acting like a baby, right? Like we get like this, like, just like blah, all these words, which is a lot of attention, right? And if the kid is attention motivated, okay, then you might be reinforcing that behavior. Okay. A lot of times the verbal stuff just kind of has no effect on behavior. So it has to be done really strategically. It has to be done in a way that is, does affect the behavior in the future, which can be tricky. So verbal reprimands, that's the first one. Second type, response blocking. Okay. So response blocking is also positive punishment. You're adding something that wasn't there before. And before we explain exactly what it is, just recognize that this is a very fine line. Response blocking can very quickly look like a restrictive procedure or a a hold. Okay, so a Gina, what's the word for that? Why can't I think of it? A restraint. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. So it's a very fine line between those things. And and some agencies are allowed to do restraints, but we are not. Okay. We are hands off as far as restrictive procedures go. Okay. So, you've got to be really careful that you're not, withholding or restraining their movement. Okay. But what a response block is when you're providing a physical intervention. So there is some physical blocking going on, and you are interrupting physically that response near the beginning or that behavior near the beginning. Okay, so you're not waiting until it's over. You're interrupting that behavior so that it doesn't end. So then theoretically, the intention there is that they don't hit the end of the behavior so they don't get that reinforcing value. Okay. So if they're striking their head against the wall and you put your hand there to stop their head from striking the wall, they're not getting the sensation of their head hitting the wall. Okay. Um, if they're going to pick their nose, then you kind of keep putting your hand there so they can't get their finger in there. But that's one where like you could see either of those, right? You could see like instead of me blocking, right, or me blocking here, okay, if I'm holding their hand so they can't pick their nose, I'm now restraining their movement. Okay, so it's very, very fine line. And you could also get like if you're blocking their nose, your hand's like right there against their face. Like, is it making it difficult for them to breathe? Right? Is it annoying them? So like now they're going to be biting your hands right there to get bit, right? So this stuff can be like, like it can be dangerous. I'm not saying, oh, use this one. I'm just saying this is one of the types of punishment that can be used. But there's a couple examples there, like, blocking the door. This is apparently a fairly famous-ish photo. I don't know. But she's blocking the door, right? So we do sometimes position ourselves so that they cannot get something dangerous, so that they cannot run out the door, right? So those are response blocking interventions that can be pretty effective. Again, but you say like, well, if you're standing and blocking the door and they're trying to get out and they really want to get out, you might start getting hit, kicked, bit, right? All those sorts of things. So things to keep in mind. All of this stuff has like some cautionary measures to it. So putting a mat between their head and the wall so that they're not hurting themselves. Okay. Holding your hands up so they can't strike your face. Okay. Holding their hands down. Okay. Well, Rob, that sounds awfully like you're restraining their movement to me. It is. It could be, right? So like some kids will accept like a gentle like hands down and you just kind of like touch their hands and it goes down. And you're saying, well, Rob, is hand over hand restrictive? Is that a restraint? It can be. If they're fighting to get their hands away from you, then it is a restraint situation, right? It's not really restraint, but it is restrictive, right? So it is the fine line that you really have to have a discussion with your team about. And then blocking the exit. So all of these are examples of response blocking. Um, Contingent exercise. Okay. This is one where it's another positive, right? So they engage in a problematic behavior, okay, dangerous behavior, whatever it might be. Okay, and because of that, okay, now they're required to complete a task that is not similar to the problem behavior in form or appearance. Okay, that's going to make more sense when we get to the one that does, which is coming up pretty soon. Okay, but in this case, it's something completely different. So they hit and so you make them do push-ups, right? They spit and you make them do, write, their name on the board 100 times. Okay. So, so these things they're not equivalent in form or appearance. So some examples of this, right? And you see a lot of cautions here. Okay, there's cautions about all punishment, but extra cards or work. Why is that cautionary? Well, because we want them to enjoy doing the work that they do with you. So we do all of this effort. We put forth all of this effort to pair learning and table work with the learner. Okay, so if you're going to start using that kind of work as a punishment, well, you're undoing a lot of that work that you did. So you got to be cautious with that. Okay, but it is sometimes the thing that would be the most effective, right? So we want to be effective. We want to be ethical and effective. So, those are the things we have to kind of keep in mind. But that could be something, right? Physical exercise, laps, push-ups, we really should not be doing that, right? So I put that there because those are examples of contingent exercise, but those are pretty clear, like making them run a lap, making them do push-ups, making them do, climb the rope or whatever it might be. Those things pretty quickly feel like pain, kind of involved interventions, right? So my kid's baseball team does this, okay, but I am not a coach on a baseball team. I'm a BCBA who is, I have to answer to the BACB and to a bunch of other things, right? Um, Now, but there could be a situation where you might say, like, okay, well, we're not going to make them do like 1,000 laps, but we're going to make them do one lap around the gym when they get up or when they bite or whatever it might be. So as a team, you might decide that, right? But really, caution is needed. Simple receptive actions in repetition, right? So stand up and sit down 10 times. That's actually the example in the Cooper book, right? Touch your nose 20 times. Now, this could look very much like that first example. So you might be doing, receptive directive following. So you might be kind of punishing them by use of doing some of that stuff that's supposed to be fun. But that idea of like, this is the punishment for this behavior with the intention of decreasing in the future. If it's effective, right, and it doesn't damage your relationship, it might be something to consider, maybe. Okay, and then repetitive work like writing their name 50 times. Okay, uh, most of our kids can't write, so that would be an impossible feat. So you should not punish them with something that they are incapable of doing. That would be cruel and unusual. All right. Just a quick example, throwing it in the middle of some types of punishment. Is this an example of punishment?
Yes.
Yes, it is. It is an example of punishment. It doesn't feel like it, right? It doesn't look like it should be, right? Ashley's yelling, "Good job," and doing a happy dance, and providing the goldfish. Okay. But the rate is decreasing, right? So even though this sounds like it's nice and good, okay, I used to be doing it 5 times, now I'm doing it 2. Okay. So either there's something that I don't like about this attention, okay, or it's just her proximity or whatever it might be. Okay. So again, it's not about the what it looks like, it's about how it affects the behavior. Nice job, Gina. All right, so next type of punishment is called overcorrection. Okay, so this is also positive punishment. You're adding something that wasn't there before. Okay, so this is a behavior reduction tactic in which, contingent on each occurrence of the problem behavior, the learner is required to engage in effortful behavior that is directly or logically related to the problem behavior. Okay, so that is why we mentioned that in our previous example. Okay, so contingent exercise, it's not the same, right? So like it's not like if they did a poor push-up, you make them do 50 push-ups. That wouldn't be contingent exercise. That would be overcorrection. Okay. So the thing that you're having them do it's related to the problem behavior. Okay. So, and there's a couple different kinds of this, right? So the first one is a restitutional overcorrection, okay, or reparative. I've also heard it referred to as reparative overcorrection. Okay. So you're repairing the damage and a little bit more. Okay. So they wreck your classroom. Okay. So you make them clean it up and you make them clean up the next room, right? They spit on the floor, you make them clean the spit and you make them, wash the desk that they were sitting at. Okay. So you're repairing the damage and a little bit more. They pushed a friend. So you make them say sorry and you make them, write an apology letter, right? So it's repairing the damage plus a little bit more. Okay, that's what makes it overcorrection. It's not just corrective. There is simple correction, which is not an overcorrection. Okay, so but it just kind of falls in this category. But simple correction is just you're repairing the damage only. And I would urge you guys to consider this one more often than overcorrection. Okay. So they dump something and you make them clean it up, and you might not even make them clean up the entire dump, right? Would that be undercorrection? I don't know. But yeah, like if you're gonna go to this full like overcorrection thing, you're probably going to end up with a battle, right? Because if they're verbal, they might be like, "I didn't even make this mess. This is unacceptable. This isn't fair." If they're not verbal, you might just get kicking and screaming and throwing and falling to the floor and all kinds of behaviors like that. So overcorrection is definitely dangerous, whereas like simple correction feels a little bit more in line to me. Positive practice overcorrection is one of my favorites. Okay. Still dangerous, but this is one of my favorite punishment strategies. So after the problem behavior occurs, okay, we have them repeatedly demonstrate the correct version of the behavior, if there is one, right? So this is like the kid comes flying out of the classroom and runs down the hallway to the library, and you're like, oh, try that again. I want to see you walk from the classroom to the library 5 times slowly, right? So you make them practice the correct behavior, right? So you could do this with a lot of things like, oh, I need you to ask nicely 5 times, 10 times, 2 times, right? So you make them do it again. So why do I like this so much? Because it does have a punishing component to it. Like, this is so obnoxious, right? Like I wanted to get there fast and now I'm getting there slower than everybody else, right? So it has that punishing quality to it, okay? Which makes us feel good, guys. Hate to say it, but it does feel like, okay, good. Now they know they can't do that. But the other piece of that is now they're practicing, they're getting motor memory of the behavior that is ideal, right? Or a better version of it. It doesn't have to be perfect. But if you can get them to do it a little bit better, you can shape that process. And now they're getting practice opportunities, right? Rob Harvey loves practice opportunities. ABA loves practice opportunities. So out of all of the punishment strategies, positive practice is often my favorite. And you could do positive practice simple correction, which would be you just have them walk once, right? Like go back and show me that you can do it correctly, right? So you're not doing it extra times. It's probably still overcorrection because they were already there, but um, that distinction's not that important, I don't think. Okay, timeout, right? Now we're flipping into negative punishment strategies. So we're removing something instead of adding it. And the actual name of timeout is timeout from positive reinforcement. Okay. I'll just roll that around in your head for a second. The name is not just timeout. The official name for timeout is timeout from positive reinforcement. Okay. Important distinction. Okay. Um, and there's two types of timeout before we kind of give some examples and some whys. So the first one is non-exclusion. Okay. So that's that first picture there. Okay. So the boy is not being completely excluded. You're like, Rob, he is kind of being excluded. That's kind of the point. Yes, but he's still in the environment. Okay. But he's losing a certain part of the reinforcement. Okay. So, and examples of this could just be planned ignoring, like like the kid did something that we don't want them to do. So I'm just kind of like turning away, orienting away from them, putting my attention on timeout to them. Withdraw a specific reinforcer. Okay, so they get to keep playing basketball, but they lose the special basketball, or they stop being the captain or whatever it might be. They don't have to lose the whole thing. Okay. They can just lose like an element of it that is a reinforcing part. And contingent observation, that is just when they're observing what's going on, but they're not allowed to participate in it. Okay. So these things can be a little bit sometimes easier to execute compared to exclusionary timeouts where you're actually removing them from the environment. Okay. Because they might be more likely, let's just sit and watch for a couple minutes, and then we can rejoin the game when we're all done with timeout. Okay. Sometimes it's harder for the kids because now they're seeing the fun going on, and that really, gets them fired up and angry. So every kid's different. Every behavior is different. Every situation is different. So you really have to go into this kind of knowing. Exclusionary times out, they're removed from the environment. So in a room, partition, hallway. So, they're out in the hallway outside. They might still hear the fun, but they have been removed from it. Okay. They might be in a different room completely. Okay. Or they might just be you might just have like a partitioned area, right? Or they might, I suppose, have their back turned. They might be sitting in the chair in the corner with their back to the room. Oh, but Rob, they can just turn around. Well, with a partition, they can peek out. In the hallway, they can run over and run back in. But the intention is that they are cut off from that group environment. Okay. And again, like, well, Rob, is it really like important to make these distinctions? Not necessarily, right? It depends on the kid. Again, like if they, if you try to take them out of the room, they're going to, kick, fight, and bite. But if you leave them in there, they're going to accept the timeout. Well, then I'm going to go with the one that they'll accept, right? So it's just to kind of be aware that, there are kind of these two different versions, and you want to pick the one that works better for your learner, that's more effective, that actually punishes the behavior. Um, we feeling good so far, Gina?
Yes.
Good. Love it. Oh, time for our third code word. Okay, this is the funny one. So, the third thing that I saw when I was on my kayak trip was wet pants, my own wet pants, uh, because I kind of, instead of putting the kayak in the water and then climbing into the kayak, I was like, I'm going to get in the kayak and then I'm going to push myself into the water, which worked really well, except the boat dipped. And I didn't realize that until my pants were suddenly flooded with water, and I had a little bit of a freak out moment where I was like, "Oh my God, I'm sinking!" I wasn't sinking. I just got a bunch of water in the boat. So wet pants is number three. Rob, we didn't realize there were going to be stories with each of these code words. Well, you're getting them either way. So wet pants is code word number three. All right, is this punishment? Gina picking at her skin?
No.
Nope, not punishment. Just to clarify, this is not a picture of our Gina, or maybe any Gina. But so no, it's not punishment. Even though we're like, but Lindsay's yelling and Gina's upset, she's crying. This really feels like punishment. Okay, but when we look at the data, we see that she's still picking her skin 25 times per hour. Okay, way too much skin picking. So again, that's the important part. Really feels like it's punishment, but it doesn't matter. It has to affect the behavior. Okay. All right. So next type of punishment is response cost. Okay. This is a very common one. Can be really valuable if you use it effectively and strategically. Okay. So there's two kinds. Okay. And the first one is definitely the most common, right? So just a straight fine. Okay. So when you engage in a problem behavior, you lose a certain amount of reinforcement. Okay. So every time you hit, you lose a star. Okay. Stars are equivalent to whatever it might be. Okay. Something you can choose from the prize box, time on the playground, whatever. A swear jar is an example of a fine. Okay. Every time you swear, you have to put money in the jar. Okay. If this happens, you lose your privilege, you lose your internet for the night. Okay. You lose time. So yeah, so that YouTube time, that's my hand. Actually, it's my cow stationary. So that was one that I drew because I couldn't find one that I liked. But so you got that list there, and every time something happens, you're crossing off an amount of time until they run out of their YouTube time. Okay. Um, so those are fines, right? So which are response costs. So because they engaged in this behavior, they're losing an amount of something that is reinforcing that then decreases the chances that they'll do that in the future, hopefully, is the intention. Bonus response cost or response cost plus bonus. I've heard it said both ways. Julie likes to say response cost plus bonus, so I prefer that one. Um, but the difference in this is that they get an extra amount of something. Okay. So they can earn something extra. They're still going to get what everybody else gets. Okay. But they get this extra reinforcement bubble. Okay. So it could work in the YouTube time that this 10 minutes of YouTube time is on top of their normal 30 minutes. Okay. So you get 30 minutes of YouTube, but you can get 10 extra minutes. Okay. If you don't hit or you don't spit or you don't, whatever it might be. And when I'm talking about these things, just a clarification point here, I'm describing them like I would say it to the kid, and you're like, well, this won't work for my kid because if I explained it to them, they wouldn't get it. Okay. This is where Rob Harvey hates when people are like, oh, this kid's too smart for this, or, like, oh, they're smart, but this wouldn't work. Because those are like excuses, and they don't need to have it explained to them to understand. Like when they see the contingency occurring, kids will often understand regardless of their language. Sometimes not. But often, yes. Oftentimes, like they're getting it, like they see the thing go away, right? That's where you really want to make it kind of as clear as possible, as visual as possible, so they see the contingency in practice. And it might not work the first time because they're not aware of it at that point, but they will kind of get used to it over time. Um, so examples of this are, we've got a kid who's hitting, right? And at the end of the day, the whole class plays a game together. Okay, and usually this kid hits like 10 times. So we put like 11 tallies on a piece of paper, and every time they hit, we cross off one of those tallies. And if at the end of the time they still have tallies left, okay, then they get to choose what game the whole group plays, right? So that's the special thing. They get to play the game no matter what, right? So they're not losing access to the game. This is like our frustration comes when like kids lose recess and we're like, but they need recess, right? They need that time to like to move and to kind of do that with their friends. So this is an option to add that thing that they still have that stakes where they can lose something, but they're not losing the thing that they feel like they deserve because everybody else is getting it. So you introduce that new thing and they could lose that. Now, if you start with 11, the idea then is if we want a really effective punishment strategy, because we don't want them hitting at all, you start with 11 because the baseline was 10 and you want them to be successful. And slowly, maybe even once a day or once an hour or once, it depends, talk to your group or your team, right? You can decrease that number sometimes pretty quickly, right? So you might have it down to just one, like in a couple weeks, or you might have it down to one tally where if they hit once, they lose that special thing, right? And you often see problem behavior kind of dipping when you have an intervention like this. All right, so we've talked about the types of punishment, and I keep talking about this caution that we have to use. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about the caution that is necessary in this. All right, so we have an ethical responsibility. So it's not just about the fact that like, you could get in trouble at work or the insurance company could be mad or whatever. Like it really is like we are trying to develop these learners to be parts of the community. And if we hurt them or damage, their pairing with other people, like we could be doing permanent damage to their kind of social interactions. We could be hurting them physically, right? We could be doing stuff that's just wrong, regardless of rules. Like it's just wrong. Okay. The rules are there too. They help us, they protect us, but we really have to remember that this is like a responsibility that we possess when you work with other people. So things we got to think about. Have we tried reinforcement first? In ABA, okay, I know I'm going against what I said at the very beginning. We didn't invent either of these things. We didn't invent punishment or reinforcement, right? But we know that that reinforcement is the more valuable of the two. It's the one that teaches things, right? So like, and our ultimate goal is to give kids the skills that they need so that they can be successful. So we got to say, like, before we use a punishment strategy, did we try reinforcement first? Okay. And if we did, okay, and it's not being effective, then we might consider, like, okay, maybe we need to add a punishment element, right? We're not going to throw reinforcement out the window. Okay. That is something that as a provider, we're saying like it's unacceptable to not have reinforcement in play. Okay. So that's the first consideration. Have we tried reinforcement? Okay. Because until we've tried that, then we really shouldn't be considering punishment unless it's something that's extremely dangerous. And as a team, we're deciding like we really need to start with this punishment procedure. Will it cause harm? Okay. Like, we don't sign the Hippocratic Oath. Okay. But we do have a responsibility to not do harm. Right. And that could be physical harm. That could be psychological or social harm, right? So, like, is it making them mistrust everyone around them to use a strategy like this? So, we got to be really mindful of that, right? Because, again, like, it's that spectrum of like, okay, like, it makes them uncomfortable. They don't like it. But ultimately, it's going to help them progress, and it's not really dangerous or painful. So, difficult decision, but important decision. Are the caregivers on board? Okay, so like you got to clear this with the caregivers, and they might be overeager. They might be like, "Yep, I've been waiting for this punishment from the beginning. This is what I want you to do," and they're like, "Ugh, don't love that." Okay, but probably more often than that, it's gonna be like, "I don't want to use this. I don't like the idea of punishment." Like I want to use positive parenting, or whatever it is that they want to do, where or like, oh, the internet says I should never use punishment. Okay. There is a lot of that, like if you look at like the dog training boards, there's a lot of like no punishment ever kind of rules, groups, mentalities. And there's a lot of that with kids too. And so we got to get them on board. We got to explain like this is why we're doing it. This is what we're also doing. This isn't the only thing we're doing, but we really need to get this hitting to stop because they're going to get kicked out of school. They're going to get kicked out of daycare, whatever it might be. So kind of, getting them on board. And if they're not on board, we can't do it, right? Like ultimately they are a consumer. So if they're not okay with it, then we got to come up with something else. Okay. Is the whole team absolutely aware of how the intervention is to be carried out? Okay, so if one person is, delivering a punishment strategy like every time the punishment occurs, but the other staff are only doing it every 5 times or 10 times or only once per session, okay, you're really setting yourself up for some big time failure. Okay, so you really have to make sure if you're going to commit to a punishment strategy, you have to make sure the whole team is on the same page. They're all using it the same way. They're using it consistently and as planned. Okay, so very important. Um, and punishment must be paired with reinforcement strategies. We're never delivering punishment by itself. Okay. So that is just one of the pieces of your treatment package. So, you always want to be pairing it with reinforcement strategies as well. Um, Otherwise, it's really not ultimately going to be effective. All right, is this punishment? I think this is our last quiz question. Is this an example of punishment?
Yes.
Yes, it is, right? And this one's tricky because you're like, well, there's no teacher or parent, like who punished her? The environment punished her, okay? But her behavior was punished. So she used to walk for some reason always down the right side of the hallway, okay? But once she stubbed her toe, she's like, I'm not doing that anymore, whether she did it consciously or unconsciously. And now she's walking down the middle to avoid that in the future. So it punished her behavior, the environment, the bookshelf, right? That path. Okay, so it doesn't have to involve another person. That was all the way back to the beginning where we talked about touching the stove. You're not going to do that again. So your behavior was punished even though there's not another person involved. Okay. Um, some factors that we need to consider. Okay. So immediacy. So when we think about punishment, reinforcement, when we think about all elements of following behavior, immediacy is very important. So the longer you wait to provide the punisher, the less likely it is to be effective. Okay. So and this is where we talk about like when schools are like, okay, if they have a bad day, don't let them have their computer at night. Okay. That makes sense for some kids, right? So if my boss said, you know what, Rob, you really messed up. I don't like what you did. You're not getting paid next week. Okay. That would change my behavior. Okay. But you know, I'm at a different place than most of the individuals that we work with intellectually and, in social understanding and things like that. And that's like a super high value reinforcer, right? It's not that super high, but like to me, it's high, right? So, but for a kid, if you say like, oh, you made a mistake, you screwed up, you hit, okay, you don't get your tablet tonight. For a lot of our kids, they're not thinking about this morning when they get home at night and their routine is to pick up their tablet and play. So when you take that away from them, their brain is not connecting their hitting, no matter like you might be like, this is because you hit this morning, okay? If they don't have the language to process what you're saying, or even if maybe sometimes they do, but now they're so upset because they had their favorite thing taken, you're probably not going to be effective. It's much more effective to have it happen in the moment. Okay, this happened, this goes away. Okay, this happened, now you need to sit, right? Holding it out behaviors or holding it out until later is very, very unlikely to actually affect the future likelihood of that behavior. And that's where like going back to that, like, adults insisting on consequences. There's like this feeling, well, they have to know this, right? We have to do something to show them that it's not right. That's more about us than about changing their behavior. That's like us feeling, okay, good, justice is served. I don't care if the behavior goes down in the future as long as they were punished, right? So, that's really something we have to be like super mindful of. Is it's not about being right, it's about being effective. Okay, so we want that future behavior to go down. Intensity or magnitude, you got to get that just right spot. Being too aversive is unacceptable, right? We talked about that, how the high the stakes are. Okay, but doing not enough is not going to be effective. So now you've done punishment and it didn't even work, right? So you've really got to find that soft spot or soft spot, that that perfect spot where where it's effective, but it's not too aversive. Okay, that just right spot. Okay, the schedule. So research shows that continuous schedules of punishment. So every time they do something, every time they pick their nose, they lose a star. Every time they hit, they go to timeout. Right? Those are going to be more effective at changing behavior while the punisher is in effect. Okay. But intermittent schedules, so like every fifth time they hit, then they lose recess, right? Or whatever it might be that you're doing. Those do have longer, they stay in effect longer after punishment is removed because they weren't expecting it every time, right? It's the same effect we see on behavior with all contingencies like that, right? If they get reinforcement every time they do it, okay, they're going to expect it to happen every time. Whereas if it's intermittent, they're not going to know when it's coming. Okay, so same thing with punishment. But that also, after you're like, okay, let's fade the punishment off, there might in their brain they're still like, oh, this might happen. Whereas if it was happening every time, they're going to be more likely to be like, oh, that's over, so now I can start doing this again if it's still effective. Availability of reinforcement for the target behavior. So the problem behavior, if hitting reliably gets other kids to go away, right? You might teach them a bunch of other things like, okay, let's say, back up instead of hitting them. Okay. And they can do that, but sometimes saying back up doesn't work. Hitting always works. Okay. So sometimes giving like reinforcing an alternative behavior isn't always going to be enough. Okay. And this is what a lot of research says is like, you know, when you're using reinforcement alone, okay, it sometimes is not effective, or sometimes it's much less effective, or it takes a really long time. Whereas if you have that punishment component, okay, so you're teaching them to say back up, but at the same time, you're also providing some punishment for when they do hit, you're probably going to see a more effective treatment package, if that makes sense. And that is more ethical because other kids are getting hit, right? It's not ethical to let other kids get hit. So introducing punishment in that case might be the responsible ethical choice. But my point back to the availability of reinforcement, like they're getting reinforcement from that target behavior replacing it's going to be difficult. It's going to take a little bit of time, but if you build in that punishment component, you might be able to kind of stop that. And then the availability for reinforcement of alternative behaviors. So if you're able to, if they're, hitting to get Skittles, okay, because the parents are just like, okay, fine, stop hitting. Here's a Skittle. If you teach them to say Skittle instead of hitting, and you can give them more Skittles, and that's available, you probably don't need to punish the hitting in that case because they're going to see, their brain's going to make that connection of, it's more effective to say Skittle. Okay. And it's a lot easier. I feel really tired after I engage in all of this hitting behavior, and it takes a really long time. And sometimes they don't even give it to me. But every time I say Skittle, they give me 5 Skittles. That's pretty great, right? All that talking again, it's just like I'm just showing you like what a brain does. They don't actually have to have that conversation with themselves. So those are some helpful tips. All right, so we have to consider, it's okay, good. 2 more slides. We're right on track. Okay, so we have to consider the fallout of punishment. Why do I keep putting some caution about punishment? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but there's a lot of fallout that happens in regards to punishment. Okay, so the first one is that punishment is going to result in big emotions, right? Upset, crying, screaming, flopping to the floor, running, like it's upsetting to be punished. Like imagine if I came to your house and I didn't like the way you were talking and I took your phone and said, "Up, no more phone." Okay? You'd be really mad about that. You'd be really, or if I said like, "I'm not paying you. Like you really screwed up. I'm not paying you this week. I'm withholding your paycheck." I see this on the Facebook boards all the time of like, my employer said that they're not going to pay me, and there's a million people there like, this is illegal, this is unacceptable. Tell them, so like it results in big emotions. Okay. So remember that doesn't mean don't do it. It just means expect that. Don't be like, "Oh, I can't believe they're so mad. They lost. They knew they were losing it, right? They're going to be upset, right? That's by nature of the punishment. You want them, if they don't care about it, it's not going to be effective. So you got to recognize they're going to be upset. Okay. They're hard to follow through with when the ante rises. Okay. So like when you like say, okay, iPad is gone. Okay. And now they start hitting and biting and breaking things and climbing the wall and, spitting and attacking their little sister, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? At some point, like, pretty quickly in that chain, like we're done. We can't handle all that stuff, right? So we might have to give into it. And then it's like, oh crap, we really messed up on this one. So we just have to recognize that like sometimes it's too hard to follow through with a punishment strategy. Okay. We can't see it through because they're going to raise the bar too high for us to follow. Okay. They can be dangerous, right? So they can result in harm so the kid gets really upset, they drop to the floor, they start hitting their head against a concrete floor. That's extremely dangerous. They start biting people, attacking people, hitting people, running out of the room, right? So remember that because of those big emotions, they could engage in behaviors that are much more dangerous than the problem behavior that you were addressing in the first place. Okay. So something that really has to be considered. This fills the bad bucket. I said don't use good or bad. This fills like the bucket of unpairing, right? Well, it's still pairing, but pairing with having a hard time not using the words good, bad, negative, positive. Um, so they're making the kid less likely to approach you in the future than more likely. Okay. So your overall relationship is being damaged instead of improved. Okay. And sometimes we have to do that. Guys, sometimes we have to do that. Sometimes you have to put stuff in that bucket that is damaging the relationship. Sometimes you have to push them to do something that they don't want to do. We just have to, but we have to be aware that that is ultimately not serving us. Okay. So, we have to be really careful. And that's why, like, we're always pairing these with really powerful reinforcement systems so that overall your relationship is still improving. So just something to really consider. This is filling up the wrong bucket, not the bucket that we want to be filling. And punishment increases that already high value of escape. Okay, so if you're using punishment strategies and they're a kid who's prone to escape or they're not, you're making escape more valuable. Getting away from you is now better because you are a punishing person, right? So again, keeping that other bucket full that pairs you with positive things, with desirable things, is key. Okay. And punishment can only stop behaviors, right? Punishment doesn't teach anything. Occasionally, someone gets like some learning from like okay, well, I got punished for that, so I try this other thing. So sometimes there's like you're like whack-a-moling and eventually like, oh, they land on a behavior that is reinforceable and you reinforce it and it worked, right? But wouldn't it be way better to maybe use punishment, but also really be using a heavy reinforcement strategy for the desirable behaviors so they know what they're supposed to do instead? That's really what we want to do, is to get them to that place that we want them to be. This is a real deep cut. Okay, so the bottom line, because Stone Cold said so. So some things that we want you to leave with. So punishment must be used with caution. So never use it lightly. Never use it just offhand, just like, oh, let's try this. Okay, always use real deep consideration and strategy. Must be planned and considered. Okay, goes hand in hand with that first one. Okay, so you're planning it together. Must be done with oversight and approval. You're not doing it all by yourself. You're not deciding what you're going to do all by yourself. You're not committing to it all by yourself. You're talking to the caregivers, you're talking to the team, you're talking to clinical supervisors. You're getting other people's opinion so that you can use it. Now, sometimes if there's a really dangerous behavior and you have to kind of think on your feet, you might have to kind of put something into play. But I would be, very cautious, and I would be checking with people immediately after, as soon as you possibly can. And then, the last one is just that, as careful as we have to be and as cautionary as this training has been, we should not just be dismissing punishment outright. Okay. It can be a very powerful tool. It sometimes is going to be the only effective way to get a dangerous problem behavior to decrease in the right direction. So we really have to consider it. So I don't want you to come out of this training saying like, oh, Rob said don't do punishment. That's going all the way back to the beginning. That's not my assertion. That is not as ABA's assertion. Punishment can be effective. We just have to be really cautious. All right, your final code word. Okay, the final thing that I saw was a great blue heron. Okay, one of the coolest things. They're like dinosaurs. They are kind of dinosaurs, right? Like dinosaurs turned into birds. But I saw either one great blue heron 4 times, or 4 great blue herons 1 time, or some variation in the middle. I think I saw two, and I saw the first one 3 times and the second one once, but who's to say? I can't, they look pretty much the same. But I did get pretty close to this great blue heron, and I watched it for a while. So super, super cool. So the fourth code word is great blue heron. Um, and that concludes the training right on time, which is fantastic. We got some great references and some resources here. Check the BACB ethics code for behavior analysts. There's also one for RBTs, which is also really valuable. Whether you are a BCBA or RBT or not, they're still good, guidelines to look at. Some other articles, and then of course the Cooper book, which I used a lot. So hopefully that was informative. Have an amazing day, and I'm going to stop the recording.